Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bible and the Novel. This is an online class because of the coronavirus. We've gotten to take all the exciting stuff we've been doing at George Fox University and move it online for our students, but also for everyone else who's interested in thinking through some really fun contemporary literature and the biblical text along with us. This week we're looking at the first 10 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. We last week watched Messiah and talked about that. It's a Netflix show that imagines what would it look like if Jesus came today or came back today. It's a bit questionable whether it's a first coming or second coming show. And if you're interested in that, you can check out that playlist on YouTube. But today we're going to turn to Mark and think about the first 10 chapters in light of Messiah and in light of all the other conversations we've had this term around what does it look like to think about this text as a story, as characters, as real people wrestling with real problems. So we'll get into hopefully some of the hard parts of the text, the frustrating parts. We'll talk about the character of Jesus. We'll talk about why Mark structures the narrative the way he does, and maybe start to find some new and exciting things in a very old and familiar text. I'm joined today by 3 students from the class, along with a friend of mine, Jason Miller from South Bend, Indiana, who's volunteering his time because we're playing with different conversational dynamics as well. How do we create interesting videos for you all to watch out there? So thank you guys so much for your time. And let's jump into the Gospel of Mark. So I've asked you guys kind of to come with some questions or some areas we can start to open up together. But maybe we should just start with the very beginning, if that would be okay, if I can just set the tone for a second. The very first verse. Now, I was looking at this last night, and it's the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, as it is written in Isaiah. And I found that really interesting because I went back and looked up the Greek. It is actually the beginning, like this idea of the start of. And I think I just wanted to call our attention to that as we start that keep that in mind. This has a very sort of open-ended narrative structure from the very first verse, saying like, this is the beginning of the story, but what's the end of the story going to be? And for those of you who read ahead to the end of Mark, that's actually a really important question for this gospel. The other thing we want to just kind of highlight here is the good news. So Mark's the first person to use that term in the way that he does, which is in reference to the Roman Empire, right? You have the good news about Caesar who comes as a savior. And so Mark, in appropriating this term in the gospel, is very much calling our attention to the political aspects of Jesus' ministry. So I think I just kind of think about how heavily loaded that first verse is. I just wanted to draw our attention to it and think about the beginning, like the open-ended sort of narrative, the open-ended nature of this narrative and the call for readerly engagement, and also that this is as much a political story as it is a religious story for Mark, which I think is an interesting thing to kind of keep in mind as we delve into the gospel. So with that, where do you guys want to go in these first few chapters?
Something interesting that I found reading Mark 1 through 10 and comparing it with the Messiah was just the massive amounts of miracles we see Jesus perform in those, little things and then big things, sending, the demons into the pigs and healing the woman who had been ill for a really long time, and he kind of just heals everybody who comes to him and asks for healing, whereas in the Messiah, he only performs a couple of miracles, and just kind of the differences between those two characters.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. Yeah, do some of the rest of you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think something that's like a connecting like trope between the two of those is this idea of like, but it's staying a secret in some sense. So Al-Masih in the Messiah doesn't ever really like proclaim like what he is, other than like that his father has sent him, like those sorts of things. And then you definitely have the trope of the messianic secret, like in Mark, where he's like explicitly like, don't tell anybody what I've done. And so I think like while there's a different amount of like miracles that are happening in each one, this idea of like keeping it kind of like hush hush, like what's happening, or not revealing everything of why it's happening, is something that's happening in both of these stories really well.
Yeah. I think it's also important to note Jesus heals a lot of people, absolutely, but he doesn't heal everyone. If you remember when he's back in his hometown, it talks about that he could not do any miracles there. This is in chapter 6, verse 5. He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them, right? So you get this, there is like this sense that he's not healing everyone who comes always, which is interesting how we can gloss over that part too. right? Like, because there are so many miracles that when he doesn't perform them, I mean, I guess, is that the way maybe miracles work? We expect miracles not to happen, so we don't really report on all the times they don't work.
I think in this narrative format, it's a little bit harder to see all the people he's not healing, just because he highlights all the people that he is healing, and each story is so short as compared to Messiah. And we're watching Al-Masih walk all around, and you can physically see the people he's not healing. So that's where I think the narrative format kind of changes it and makes it a little bit easier for us to see and highlight everybody that Jesus has healed.
Yeah,
Like we don't have all the extras on the scene like we do in the film or in the show.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because a lot of times it describes like, and there were the crowds, right? But again, that's something we kind of gloss over in our narrative imagination. We forget that there's, thousands of people there, and he heals this one. There were probably a lot of other people that were sick. So he starts to make, the question of Jesus's character, right? Like Jenna's kind of already pointed us there with Al-Masih being, secretive. What's this about? The messianic secret in Mark. What do you think of Jesus as a character in Mark? Do you like him?
He's a little more hard-edged than my sort of sentimental or devotional image of Jesus. He's a bit more rogue. He's a bit more, and maybe it's also because I was watching Messiah alongside it, so you kind of feel the sort of edginess of that character in relationship to everything going on around him. But this reading for me was kind of a fresh, like, he's got some kind of tough edges, the way he's pushing against these expectations. Like when he flaunts the Sabbath laws, it feels very like rebel, right? Like it's, I felt freshly sort of in touch with that part of Jesus in this reading.
Yeah. So one of the things with ancient literature, or like with the Gospels in particular, the way they do biography, we don't get a lot of adjectives. And one of the things that's really fascinating is to look at the adjectives used for Jesus in like just the first chapter, starting around verse 21. He's described as someone who has authority, and then I love it, not like the teachers of the law, right? So it's like this lovely sort of like cutting. In verse 25, he's described as stern. And then down a little bit later, he's described in verse 41 as, depending on the ancient manuscript, either indignant or angry, or filled with pity. He also gives a strong warning in verse 43. And then he's like inhabiting the lonely places. And I find that really interesting as like a collection of descriptors in the first chapter. He's angry, he's stern, he's indignant, he's lonely, and he's filled with authority.
Yeah, hard edges a little bit, right?
Yeah.
I definitely feel, compared to the other Gospels, that Mark is very much rushed in Jesus's story. I think Mark is the shortest Gospel, and it just kind of flies through everything really, really fast. And so I think you may not necessarily get all the, kind of details and the different sides of Jesus that you see in some of the other Gospels, just because it feels so rushed.
Yeah. What does that do to you as a reader?
I mean, for me, it's kind of like Mark never knew Jesus based on what I know, based on who they think Mark the writer was Mark with Paul. And so I think a lot of this was phrases that he learned from Peter. And so he doesn't necessarily have all the details that some of the other writers had, because they were there when Jesus was there, or, were alive during that time when Jesus was on earth.
Yeah, so this is maybe a good time just to say a couple things about the composition of Mark. So traditionally it's attributed to John Mark, who was a traveling companion to Luke. And it, again, traditionally is associated with Peter's account. It was John Mark writing down Peter's account. Contemporary modern Bible scholars don't see any like actual historical evidence for any other of that, other than that it was the tradition. It's definitely, they think though, the earliest of the Gospels, composed before the popular uprising in Israel that led to the destruction of the Romans coming in and destroying the temple in 70 AD. So they put it somewhere between about 60 and 65 AD for a number of reasons, one of which is that the kind of definite sense that the temple will be / has been actually already destroyed doesn't come up in the prophetic conversations in quite the same way. So it feels a bit less like it's reporting on something that's already happened. And for a long time, literary or biblical critics thought that it was a condensing of Matthew and Luke, but that's been reversed in the past 50, 75 years, as it's now one of the probably foundational stories. Which then it kind of does beg this question, like, why did he write it this way, right? Like, what's the narrative effect? I think it's really easy to approach the Bible as a sort of, it just kind of happened this way, or it just looks this way. But there's a lot of careful literary crafting going on here. And so I think it's like a really important question. I was like, well, what's going on with this? Why is it a political story as much as a sort of a beginning of the story, but maybe not the end of the story? And why would he choose to emphasize this kind of rushed pace that Ali's pointed out? And this hard-edged Jesus that Jenna and Jason have pointed out, like what's the point of crafting Jesus this way? I mean, it fits with the political stuff, right? Like you don't want your political revolutionary to be too timid and meek, because that doesn't get very far. But so what's going on with that? Like, why would you do that as a writer?
I'll say, to me, there's an adrenaline reading Mark. I actually, there's almost like a physiological feeling reading Mark that I don't get reading the others, precisely because of the pace that you're talking about. I'm a little winded when I read Mark, and maybe that's good. Maybe there's an excitement or an energy to that. I think for me, I feel almost like an excitement trying to kind of keep up with the pace of developments in it.
Right, like something's happening. Like this is the beginning of an exciting story. Things are happening. The world is changing, and you, reader, are you going to be a part of this story that's happening? Like,
yeah, I think that it incites the readers in some way. Like you have like the mark and tick of like immediately and on the way and then immediately, and like this kind of like it's drawing you into that. And some of the like hard edges and Jesus not fully explaining all of his parables and being kind of confusing, like we're then drawn into that. Like I think you can insert yourself as into this gospel easier than some of the other ones that are more like highfalutin and like flowery in some places. Like I think that this one, I don't know, feels a lot more human in some sense.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting in chapter 4, verse 34, he says he did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples he explained everything. That one just really stuck out to me because it was interesting that he chooses to use all these parables, and this is how the Gospel of Mark is set, in a bunch of parables, and we see all the miracles. So just kind of interesting that Jesus intentionally gives the public the parables, but he's only explaining it to the disciples. That really stuck out to me there.
Yeah. That does a couple of interesting things. I mean, one, it reminds us that like Jesus is being intentionally cagey, right? Like he's not just like kind of weird, which in John, he just sometimes seems kind of weird, right? And even in Messiah, there's moments where you think, are you like a real person? But no, like they get like, back home, sit down. Like, so what in the world was that one about? Jesus, you guys, here we go. Okay, fine. Let's play. Like, so that you get this, like, Jesus is being intentionally cagey, but also that there is this other side that his friends get to see. That all the times that we don't see it, maybe, it kind of does beg what's going on off stage, right? What happens? Mark to me feels very cinematic, which is a totally anachronistic term to use, obviously, for the Gospel of Mark. But you get the sense of like these exciting sort of cuts. But you can imagine that, okay, cut, and like, then what happens? Well, there's probably a lot more interpersonal stuff, which I think maybe it minimizes the hard edge on Jesus. I'm thinking especially like the interaction with his family, where he kind of disavows his family who are waiting outside. But then like what happens, right? He says this really like, almost what sounds like an offensive sort of thing, who are my mother and brothers? But then like what happens, when the camera's off, when the writer turns his back, does he go home with them? Maybe, mom, I was always saying, I mean, like, so you do get the sense of like, there is this backstory, or this, not backstory, but an off-camera story going on that we're not privy to. It's interesting.
This is a thought that I'm just having now for the first time, but because I've wrestled with that too. It almost seems kind of uncharitable or ungenerous of Jesus to like fling these things out there that the people won't ever understand, but you're my people. But I guess as the reader, it's interesting, we get to be privy to the inside. It almost positions us as sort of privileged sort of participants in the life of Jesus by getting to hear the inside story. I hadn't really thought about that before, but that does a little bit something to me to kind of counterbalance the frustration I feel at Jesus being so cagey or coy about these things, right? But that we get to be inside on all that.
Right, and I think that actually fits really well with a lot of what Mark is doing in the narrative, in terms of like, who is this man? And you reading Community, are you part of the people who get it, or are you part of the people who maybe your vision isn't 100% yet, or are you still with the people who don't get it? If you did you notice how many times questions like, who is this? Who is this man? Who is this that even the wind and sea obey him? Like, these questions of Jesus's identity seem to like shape every single pericope. And so it invites the reader, like, are you part of the group that gets it? It almost becomes like a narrative game between the author and the audience. Which, yeah, I don't know, maybe helps explain some of the hard edges.
Hey, also along the lines of the secrecy that we were talking about, I was really struck by how in 8:32, when he's foretelling his death, he said all this quite openly.
Mm-hmm.
So he's super secretive about the things that like would elevate him, right? He performs a miracle, don't tell anyone. You declare on the Messiah, don't tell anyone. I'm going to die a criminal's death, wide open about that. Just the really stark contrast to that really struck me. And I don't entirely know what to do with it yet, but it's interesting. It feels like it's too on the nose to be like accidental or unintended for some kind of effect for us, right?
Right.
No, I agree. I think that the idea of like the suffering servant and some of the like passion predictions in Mark's Gospels are like some of the most like outright like straightforward things that like Jesus says, like, no, like I'm going to like die like a gruesome suffering death, but which I don't know what that does to the emphasis of it, that maybe like that's what Jesus wants to be known for more, is being like this servant for all of us, not necessarily known for like being like a celebrity in some sense.
Yeah.
Well, especially because isn't it like 3 times there that you kind of have that pattern of like, we know who Jesus is, he's the Messiah, and then he predicts his death, and then James and John or Peter or somebody resists the suffering in the narrative, and then Jesus pushes back with, no, but to be like me, you're going to have to carry your cross too, right? That it's like over and over again, it's working out that tension of like, yes, this is who I am, but it's going to go a direction you don't want it to go. You're going to resist it, and I'm going to call you into that same kind of sort of dying life, right? I was really, really struck by that in those last like 8, 9, and 10.
I was looking for the not quite so successful healing. Where does that one happen?
Oh, the man who sees trees?
Yeah, the man who sees trees.
8:22. Yeah, 8:22.
Yes, sorry, I was looking on the wrong half of the page. So one of the things that's interesting is this is the miracle that actually precedes the first of Jesus's prediction about his death. And all 3 of the predictions are then finished with Bartimaeus, whose healing seems to be like right and exact. And I think I've always had problems with this healing. So it's like, wait, how is it that Jesus doesn't get it right the first time? Like, oh, wait, like, let's try that one again. Like, it's like a Harry Potter spell that goes wrong the first time, right? Or something like, like, that's not Jesus. Jesus is supposed to get it right. But it struck me because of this tension between like, do you get it and do you not get it? And who's understanding what's happening and who's not? That this healing actually frames all of these predictions. And it's exactly that model of people sees but doesn't see. I see the people, but they're bigger than they're supposed to be. And every single person then mistakes Jesus in these next few in these predictions of his death.
Wow.
As that
so like
what the Messiah is.
Yeah, Peter sees you are the Messiah, but he doesn't see what it's gonna lead to. He resists it. So that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm just thinking of this right now because of another conversation I was in, that trees, the idea of being like a tree planted by the water is oftentimes like a symbol for Israel, right? The fig tree is a symbol for Israel. The one who's grounded in Torah is like a tree grounded by a flowing brook. And so to be seen as trees, right? It's this kind of, it's a very powerful, a very grounded, very powerful sort of image, a very tall image, a very grandiose sort of image for Israel in its flourishing. But to see the people like that and to not see them as people, to not see the human, to not see the suffering servant, to not see kind of the incarnational aspect of all this, to only get the political hope and not the atoning death side. So I'm thinking that that's probably why Mark puts that miracle there. And then we get Bartimaeus, who, what do you want? Rabbi, I want to see. This is the very end of chapter 10. Go, your faith has healed you. Immediately he received his sight, and he followed Jesus along the road. And that just feels like such a loaded verse, because to follow Jesus along the road, this is the road to Jerusalem. This is the road to the cross. And so what does Bartimaeus do when he's healed? He wants to see. He wants to actually get it, which means we have to follow Jesus down this road now, the road to the cross.
My NRSV has it as followed him on the way.
On the way, yeah.
Which on the way, it just has a resonance there, like on the way of Jesus, yeah.
Yep, yeah.